This is 365 2010. Too much, Dave. You'll notice that my dearest life partner is behind me pointing a butter knife at me. We're not quite sure why that's happening at this point, but it is happening. It is a bit distracting, but we'll try to take no further notice of it. Funny, we've been talking a lot about openness lately, and people have been taking their positions one way or the other. I end up in this strange position of having to work on a conference presentation proposal for open source software, which I haven't done in a while. And I remember being very vocal about the power of open source software at one time. I've since spent a lot of time working on open source projects, and I've seen some of the good and some of the bad and some of the things that can be frustrating. And it's a really interesting revisitation of why I think open source is important, and why I think it's valuable, and why I think it can work. I think the first thing, and I'm just sort of going over the things I'm going to be saying in this proposal, it's just kind of helpful to say it out loud. I think the first thing is to remember to compare apples to apples. Most open source projects fail the same way that most corporate projects fail. If you look at the number of times that people try to do something, if you count them all up and you put them all on the line, most of them are going to fall down. I mean, that's just the way things are. I think that because the open source projects get out there quicker and they have wider distribution, we tend to see more of them maybe than we would have sort of more closed sourcey stuff. And that's important to think about. I think also in terms of survival, it's important to remember that good open source projects, the ones that are that have a good code base and stuff, take something like WordPress, it doesn't matter what happens to it at this point, because the code is good enough that no matter what the company does or how disreputable, not that they are, whatever problems there could be, the code will live on because it's open. And it just has to move on to WordPress or whatever, and it'll be fine. And I think in terms of the security of whatever you're doing, good open source code is far more secure than corporate code. And that's a really big thing. And the third thing is that code from a corporate perspective, a company that has shareholders where the money that they make is dependent on selling of software, their entire structure is designed to make the most money possible for their shareholders. The decisions that are being made in the creation of the software are about making money for the shareholders. Often, that is not the same thing as making it easy for a user to use or useful for a user. Sometimes those things coincide. Sometimes, in the case of Apple's software, for instance, in case of OS X, it just so happens that it turns out that it's in Apple's best interest to make the best operating system possible. And they've done an extraordinarily good job of that, even though it's built on a great deal of open source code. In other cases, it serves a corporation to trap people into the software that they have and only give them the barest things they need and force them into paying more to get the things they actually need. Those kinds of situations are really bad, and they're things that will never happen to you in an open source project if you're careful at all, and things that often happen inside of those other kinds. And I think when you're looking at the long-term viability of your own work, the long-term viability of any organization, that's where open source really comes through, is just how much safer it is to have your stuff in an open source environment. Because you can depend on it being there. You can depend on the code being there. You can depend on getting it out. You can depend on not being at the whim of market forces. And I think that's the real security. Yes, your software is also going to be better because it's designed for the user and designed by the user in a lot of cases. But it's also safer. Yeah.
You're very smart.
That's very kind of you to say that I'm very smart, even if you're being snide. Snide.
I have a butter knife.
We discussed that earlier. This is Dave Cormier, 365 2010, Too Much Dave, episode 11.